Hey there. Today we're going to walk through which code editor you should be learning first. Now when you're starting to learn to code, it's often a little bit difficult to understand, where you're actually supposed to write that code. Do you write this in Windows Notepad, or do you download a full feature, code editor? Well, in this video, I'm going to answer that question and also share with you a strategy that I think will help you out as you start learning to code and go down that journey. Now, this is a little bit of a tough video to make because in a lot of cases, people get very passionate about which code editor they're using or which IDE. We'll get into these terms in a second. But anyways, this is just my preference and my advice that I would have given myself when I started learning to code, and I'm going to give it in this video too. Now, when we think about code editors, we can actually think about this from several different levels. So starting from the least amount of features to the most amount of features, we can start at something like a basic text editor. So in Windows, it's going to be Notepad, and I think in Mac it is like Text Edit or something like that. And that's just basically where you open up, and you write simple text. So this is just plain text. Then moving up, you can go to terminal-based text editors such as Vim or Emacs or even Nano. And then moving up, you can go to more complex code editors such as VS Code, Visual Studio Code, Atom, Sublime, and a couple others. And then finally, you can make it up to an IDE or Integrated Development Environment. Now, we're going to talk about each of these in detail, but I just wanted to lay out the landscape. That is what you're looking at right now, from least amount of features all the way to the most amount of features. Everything that I just mentioned accomplishes the same exact thing. It allows the developer to write code, but it does do it in a very different way depending on how many features you have. And when I say features, all I'm talking about is productivity tools for the developer. So if you're working in Notepad, as we'll see in a couple minutes, it's going to be extremely difficult to manage multiple files at once and have a very quick developer workflow. Now, if you move up to an advanced code editor like Visual Studio Code, or even an IDE, let's say that you're using Python, you might download a premium product like PyCharm. These are going to speed up your development workflow significantly when you're writing much bigger projects. Now, before I get into all the details and examples, I want to make a few distinctions here. Now, the first one is that the coding language that you are learning is going to affect which tools you're going to use here. Now, on one hand, learning JavaScript in a simple text editor, something super simple, there's not a lot of features, is actually beneficial because you're learning the language itself. You're not getting a bunch of assistance from something like an integrated development environment or IDE. Now, if you're learning Java, the story is a lot different. If you're trying to learn Java, you have to have an IDE. Like, technically you don't have to, but it's going to make your life much harder if you're not using an IDE such as Eclipse, NetBeans, or maybe a premium version like IntelliJ. And the reason being is because the way that these languages are compiled is a little bit different, and the tooling to actually run these different languages, or the code written by these languages, is going to be very different. So keep this in mind as you're going through this video, and please note that I'm going to be showing JavaScript examples primarily because that's what I mostly cover on this channel, and I assume that a lot of people watching it are going to be interested in that, along with different types of web development. Up to this point, I've been throwing around terms as if you knew them, so let's back up and make a few distinctions between a few terms here. So the first one I want to do is code editor versus text editor. Is there a difference? The simple answer to that question is no. There's not really a huge difference between a code editor and a text editor. But the simple answer is not that descriptive, so let's jump into some of the differences you might find. So a text editor is something that just writes plain text. And when we're talking about plain text, that's a huge thing to understand here when you're learning to code. There's a difference between plain text and rich text format. So think about Microsoft's Notepad versus Microsoft Word. Now, the Notepad is a plain text editor, and Microsoft Word is a rich text editor, which basically means you can do a lot of formatting, such as putting text into bold or italics. You can have headings, all that kind of stuff. That is rich text editing. Now, when you're writing code, you never want that. You will never write code within Microsoft Word unless, of course, you're doing, some sort of coding interview and someone wants you to write pseudocode. Most cases, you're not going to use Microsoft Word. You're going to use a plain text editor. And when we're looking at plain text editors, pretty much anything that you'll come across in terms of a code editor is going to be a plain text editor. Now, a code editor is usually just referred to as something that's very specific to writing code. Microsoft's Notepad is a basic text editor that is not optimized for coding. It doesn't have any features that would help out a developer like myself. Now, a code editor is, it does the same thing. It writes plain text just like Notepad, but it also has some features that are developed specifically for coders. And a couple of those is like the file management pane. In things like Visual Studio Code, Atom, and Sublime, you'll be able to manage your files a lot easier, and a lot of additional features. So that's really the only difference between a text editor and a code editor. Now, the next distinction that we have to make before we get into anything is the difference between a text editor or code editor versus an IDE, or Integrated Development Environment. I'm filming this video in late 2020, and over the last several years, the tool sets that coders have at their disposal has become better and better, especially the open source free solutions such as a code editor like Visual Studio Code. So there is becoming less and less of a distinction between a code editor like Visual Studio Code and an IDE such as Visual Studio. There's actually a difference between those two. Now, with an IDE, what we can think of these as is like an extended version of a code editor. An IDE is going to have many more features than a basic code editor, and in addition to that, it is usually, not always, but usually dedicated to a specific tech stack or language. So, like I said earlier, if you're writing Java, you're going to use one of a couple different IDEs, whether that be Eclipse, IntelliJ, or NetBeans, or a couple others. Now, you wouldn't want to use certain IDEs for Java, just like you wouldn't want to use certain IDEs for Python. So they all kind of come in different flavors and are meant to suit a specific language or framework. IDEs are sometimes free, but often come at a price as well. There's a company called JetBrains which makes a ton of IDEs, including something like PyCharm or IntelliJ, and these are premium IDEs that developers actually have to pay for on a yearly basis. Now, this company is still in business for a very good reason. Developers like good tools and they're willing to pay for them. Now, what would they be paying for, you might ask? Well, these are some additional features that you might find in an IDE. One feature you might find in an IDE is code completion. Now, like I said, an IDE is generally created for a specific coding language, which means that it has a very good idea as to what kind of things you might be writing in that coding language. So it can actually predict what you're about to type and make your job a lot easier by just being able to press tab and complete that line of code. You might also find specific compiler tools within your IDE. So for example, if you're writing Python, you're going to have the choice between a couple different Python interpreters. You can use the 2.7 interpreter or the 3.x interpreter, and you might want to switch between these two interpreters. Now, you can use command line tools such as virtual env, but it's a little bit tedious to use the command line tools to switch back between those. It's actually easier if you have an integrated development environment that can actually just have a drop down where you can select, okay, now I want to use the 2.7, now I want to use the 3. Whatever version of the Python interpreter. And so it's a lot quicker that way. Among other features, you might also find things in an IDE such as version control tools, advanced debugging tools, and even things like database management tools. You could probably even manage your database connected to your web apps within one environment. And basically what it does is it groups all of these tasks that you would have to do, opening separate windows and terminals, all in one place. Like I said, there is a lot of overlap between really good code editors, such as Visual Studio Code, and IDEs. You're going to find some overlap, and some of that overlap might be IntelliSense or code completion. You don't have to buy an IDE to get that in some cases. Visual Studio Code has a great IntelliSense or code completion, especially with languages like TypeScript. A code editor like Visual Studio Code also has version control tools, has some debugging tools, and has an extensions marketplace. So there is a lot of overlap, but as you get better writing code and as you develop more specific types of projects, it will become more apparent when an IDE comes into play and will actually help out your development workflow versus just sticking with a free classic code editor. With all of those distinctions out of the way, I think it's finally time that we can answer the question that the title of this video addresses. And that question is, which code editor should you learn first? Now, I'm going to answer this in a couple parts because, as always, the answer is not so straightforward. What I think I would have told myself as a developer, starting over again, is I would start out in a basic code editor such as Visual Studio Code and learn the basics of coding within that. Or you could even use something, a browser-based editor. There's a lot of learning resources that allow you to actually type code into a browser and automatically compile it and get it checked by the web service that you're using. A good example of that would be something like Codecademy. Eventually, though, you'll have to go to local development, and for that, I would recommend something like Visual Studio Code. I think this is an awesome tool, very easy to use getting started, but also has a lot of features that you can use in the future. Now, like I mentioned before, if you're starting out in a language like Java, this is not going to apply, but especially since this channel is focused on JavaScript mainly, in most cases, if you're learning JavaScript, I'd recommend starting here. Now, after you've done that and understood your coding language a little bit better, so you're getting more acquainted with writing this coding language, I would actually go backwards a little bit and learn a terminal-based text editor like Vim, Emacs, or Nano. Now, there's a very good reason why I suggest doing this, and I think that you'll find this advice helpful kind of later down the road. It's probably not going to be so apparent right away. The reason that I recommend learning a terminal-based editor like Vim, that's the one that I use at least, is so that when you get in the situation where you have to make a small change to a file or actually create a file and add something to it on a server, and you don't have the benefit of a code editor or a text editor with a graphical user interface, you're going to need to know how to do this. And this will become very apparent when you spend an entire hour trying to, open up a file, make a simple change to it, and close that file in a terminal-based environment. Just trust me on this one, you're going to want to learn this. But you should not learn it at the very beginning, because learning these tools has a learning curve on its own. And when you're trying to learn how to actually write your code and use the text editor at the same time, that can often get very confusing and is somewhat impractical. While I'm going to show you Vim in this video, I'm not going to teach it to you. And I don't want to leave you high and dry here, so I actually have a video up here that explains how to use Vim. I think Vim is a good choice. I don't think you can go wrong with it, so feel free to explore the other ones, Emacs and Nano, but I really think Vim is a good choice for you to start out with. After you've spent a few weeks or maybe even months within a tool like Vim and learn how to basically open a file, edit it, and close it within a terminal-based environment, then I would suggest going back to your code editor, because in reality, it's not practical to write all of your code within something like Vim. It's just going to take you too long. And using the tools at your disposal is a very smart thing to do. And then finally, as you decide whether you need to buy an IDE or something, I would just wait on that until you have a very specific reason to do so. And a reason that you might find is maybe you get hired by a company that uses a specific IDE, and in that case you have to learn it. Or maybe you start building big enough projects and have specific requirements that warrant the purchase of a specific integrated development environment. In that case, you'll probably know when it's time to do that. And in the meantime, it's usually sufficient to use a code editor such as Visual Studio Code. If you're watching this video, you probably don't have a very good idea as to, the productivity gains that you might get with a code editor. And so in this last part of the video, I want to actually jump into a basic example where we're going to create a web page, a very simple one, but we're going to create a web page in a couple different tools, and it'll become very apparent how using a code editor like Visual Studio Code or even an IDE is going to save you a ton of time. So believe it or not, I actually have a web page sitting on my screen right now. And it doesn't look like it, but these are all the files required to create a website. So let me actually open up Google Chrome on the index.html file that I've created, and we'll see that this is actually a full-on website. So let me drag this over to the screen, and you can see my basic golf website. I'm a huge golfer, thought I'd put this together. And as you can see, this is relatively simple. You just have a start button. It doesn't really do anything, but it's a simple web page to illustrate some of these concepts. So let me close out of this and explain a little bit what's going on. Right here, I've created this website in a series of Notepad files. And what I want you to notice here, don't worry about this guy up here for now, but what I want you to notice is that in these Notepad files, there's no code highlighting or anything like that. It's all just black text. And although I do have some good formatting, I've tabbed things over so that it's easier to read. This doesn't really come out of the box. It really is hard to format things within a text editor like Notepad. So it's a little bit harder to read, and it's definitely harder to write. But since I have very simple files, it's very doable. And as you'll see here, here's my CSS file that's basically styling my HTML file. There's really no need to understand the code going on here. I just wanted to show you highlight some of the features of the text editor itself. So I just have these two files, and if we open up this index.html, that's how we actually get to this website here, which is hosted on my local file system. Now this is just a basic website. It's really not using a lot of code. It's just HTML and CSS. But I also created a very simple JavaScript program that is going to just do a little bit of a math problem. And the way that we can run this, I'll just pull up Windows PowerShell. You can run it in any terminal. But I just have to go over to the directory that I want to run it from. Having a hard time typing here. So let's see, documents, sample golf website, clear out the terminal. And then all I want to do is just run with the Node compiler or Node runtime. I want to run this math.js file. And you'll see that it comes out with the output of 16, which is basically what I'm doing here. I have a function which is going to multiply these two numbers and print it out to the screen. And you can see that I wrote this within Notepad, and I ran it in the terminal, and it works just fine. But this will quickly get tedious. If I'm trying to build a full-on web app, I'm going to have hundreds and hundreds of files that I have to go in and out of very quickly. And doing this all in Notepad, you can only imagine how many different windows that I'd have to have open at one time and how confusing that would get. So we'll use a code editor such as Visual Studio Code to demonstrate how much easier this gets when you use the right tools for the job. So right here, I've actually opened up Visual Studio Code in the directory that I created this website. And I'll show you all of the features that helps you work a little bit faster. So the first one, you have a file explorer. You can actually select different files and open them all from this file explorer. And you can actually do things like split files. So I can open up index.html on the right and the style.css on the left, and I can edit both of those at the same time. So this is an extremely useful feature. Not only that, but I can open up a new terminal at the bottom and say I wanted to run this JavaScript file. All I have to do is run it in the terminal here, and I get the same answer that I got opening up that PowerShell window and running the Notepad file. So it's all the same file, it's just edited and used within a different tool, in this case the Visual Studio Code editor. These are all the same files. They haven't moved on my computer. They're just being used in a very different way, a much more efficient way. So I want to wrap this up with a very quick talk about using the right tools. So when you're learning to code, the inclination that you'll have is to exercise the new skills that you've learned. So in my case, something that happened to me was I was super excited that I learned the Vim terminal-based text editor, and I had all of these new skills. So I went down this path for months of trying to use Vim to actually write all of my web apps. And I was super excited about this new skill that I had, but the output of my work was not good. You know, you can't write code quickly within Vim unless you are very advanced and are very comfortable using it. And in most cases, it's really just not worth doing that. It's a lot easier to download a free tool like Visual Studio Code and be able to have a much quicker workflow from the get-go. Like I said, when you're learning to code, it is very cool to have all of these new skills, but you don't have to use all of these at once, and I would not recommend doing so. While it is important to understand what the tools that you are using are doing, it is also important to use those tools to your advantage. Let me give a quick example here. So in Visual Studio Code, they actually have a feature called source control. And this is going to allow us to manage our Git repository within the code editor itself. So I can click initialize the repository, then I can actually commit the different changes. So I can come up here and click commit. I want to stage all my commits, and then I want to write my first commit or something like that. After that, I can actually publish all of these code files to GitHub. So all I have to do is pull push. I want to push to, and then I want to add a remote URL, and I want to add it from GitHub. So it's wanting me to allow access to Visual Studio Code. I can press continue. I can authorize GitHub, confirm my password, open back up Visual Studio Code, allow that extension, and now I can actually push these files to a repository that I have within my GitHub account. So it's really simple, it's an awesome tool to use, but if you don't understand how to use Git in the first place, then you're at a disadvantage. Now, you don't have to know, the most complex things about Git, but you should at least know everything that I just did using the Visual Studio Code editor. So things like initializing your repository with git init, or adding, staging the changes by doing git add, and then git commit to actually, write your first commit message. So as you can see, the Visual Studio Code editor has all of these things covered for you, but make sure that you understand what's going on behind the scenes, and then you can actually leverage these tools because once you've learned it, there's no sense in making your job harder. You can just click through the code editor and do all of these things a lot quicker. So the point is, use the tools that you have to your advantage and don't get bogged down in, I have to do everything manual here. In today's world, the software that you have to write is very complex, and you almost have to rely on various tools such as these code editors to help you do that. Otherwise, you're just going to be not as effective. Nobody's going to hire you because you don't know how to use different tools, and you're going to work a lot slower than the guy next to you. I've said a lot here, so let me recap. What I would recommend for someone starting out learning to code, or advice to my former self, would be start out in a code editor like Visual Studio Code. It's totally free, and it will really help you focus on learning the code itself. After you become more acquainted with the language you're learning and you have a better grasp of how to actually get, little programs to work, then I would jump into a terminal-based editor such as Vim for at least a couple of weeks until you can create files, open them, edit them, do a couple simple commands, etc. And then after you've done that, jump back into the code editor and don't switch to an IDE unless you have a pretty good reason to do so. And that will become apparent much later down the road. And that's it. I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and maybe even drop a like on this video. Really would appreciate that. And until next time, I will see you later.